So what I want to talk about is a VoLTE reality check of sort of the VoLTE hype cycle. Everything goes through a hype cycle. We had LTE with a hype cycle, signaling with a hype cycle. VoLTE's kind of in the middle of that hype cycle. And I'm trying to balance that with where the legacy network is going and where it is. Let's talk about some stats and things that are affecting operators. So the operator challenges they face, they're basically introducing new technology. VoLTE, video broadcast, virtualization, NFV, SDN. Those are all topics that we hear, the industry buzzwords out there. Huge subscriber growth. LTE is the fastest growing technology, and with that, the subscriber growth on the LTE side, diameter basically comes along with it. So that's either with LTE subscriber growth, it could be policy-driven growth, and VoLTE and video broadcasts are kind of the emerging services that are actually then driving even more diameter. That's coupled with the maintaining the legacy. So these are always-on customers, always-on networks. You have to maintain that legacy network in order to keep your SS7 network up and running. In the last 5 to 10 years or so, there's been a number of vendors that have basically bowed out of the market. So operators are facing a dilemma. They have either older equipment or equipment that's going either end of product sale and or end of life and into support. What am I going to do with my network? Am I going to consolidate on an existing vendor? Am I rolling new vendors? And how am I going to manage these services over the next couple of decades? And then on the operational side, you have always-on subscribers, and the expectation from Wall Street regarding flat revenues overall and ever increasing OpEx there. And then signaling outages are media worthy. So what that means is you're either going to be taken by your regulator if you have an outage, or basically taken to the street, from say a Bloomberg or something like that, reporting that you're having a major operational issue. On the left, on the right-hand side here, sort of a mapping of where we are in the sort of life cycle of 2G, 3G, and 4G subscribers. And as you see, that little green mark there in 2015 is quite small overall comparatively with the existing subscribers that are actually using 3G and 2G networks. So I like to say we're a little polluted in North America here regarding LTE. We just kind of expect LTE to be everywhere and everybody's using LTE. I'm not sure why the rest of the world hasn't really caught up. We really had a couple-year head start on the rest of the world. So some of those larger countries in the world that have large subscriber bases are just starting to come online now. And the two ones I point at most frequently are China and India. You have 1 billion plus people in each one of those countries, and they're just really getting rolling started with their LTE deployments, or they're just beginning their commercial deployments. And so if you take a look at that middle row there with LTE and VoLTE, you can clearly see that LTE has more or less had a 5-year head start as compared to VoLTE. VoLTE is really starting to gain traction now with lots of operators starting to deploy it and move it out of kind of the demo and or trial phase and actually into production phase. We haven't really hit too many. We're only about 25 now. Hopefully when we come back next year, maybe it's closer to 100. We really haven't gotten that mainstream traction across the globe with a number of operators rolling it out. And then you have on the bottom there is just sort of a diameter market. The diameter market is really reflective of the growth with LTE and its associated use cases. Let's talk about a few more stats. So obviously tremendous growth. If you talk about compound growth rates, LTE and VoLTE are moving basically very fast upward in sort of a hockey stick perspective. But they're also starting relatively small as compared to the overall number of connections in the world. As of 2020, 64% of the overall world's population, 64% will have access to an LTE network. Okay, so that's a pretty good number. But like again, in North America, if we put that same number up, it's probably close to 85 or 90% of U.S. customers have access to an LTE network today, completely, and that's today versus to 2020. And going down here on the left, so fastest adopted wireless technology, 64% covered by 2020. But what about the actual connections? So you have to have an LTE network, but you also have to have an LTE device to connect to that network. So only 28% of the customers in the world using wireless technology will be using LTE at that point. They'll have an older handset, they might be using a 3G smartphone. It could be Internet of Things that's basically only using 2G and 3G because they don't really have the bandwidth or latency needs. It could be a number of things, but you can see it's relatively slow rolled. So you have to ask yourself, what about those 72% in 2020? What are they using? Well, they're using 2G and 3G. And if they're using 2G and 3G, they're essentially using their SS7 legacy network. Bottom graph is basically showing you the sort of the hockey stick of growth there, but still, 2014, only 6% are using LTE in the world. We get to 2020, it gets up to 28. And then a recent report has come out from Exact Ventures. They're basically forecasting the diameter signaling controller market versus the STP market. As you can see here, you have a pretty significant, $400 million market, $400 plus million market for STPs going, off and to the right. And it's, you have to ask yourself, as that plane kind of chokes on down, where does it get to a point where it's, under 100 million or relatively, relatively small. So these are things that you have to think about is how long, essentially, will your SS7 network need to live? And that's the topic here. So customers have choices. Customers can either migrate to OTT services. We see that not so much in North America, but certainly in South America, in Europe, and in Asia in large quantities. And you have the operators kind of fighting back with VoLTE as their kind of arm of choice to push back against those OTT players. From the market information I've seen, I haven't seen a huge amount of conversions, and I'm trying to come up with a term here. We have in the sort of the triple play world of basically delivering broadband, to your home, and you have cord cutters, where people are basically saying, I don't want your video service, just give me the internet, and I'll basically go over the top of Hulu or wherever it may be, or Netflix. We need to come up with basically a term for a person who has essentially abandoned their voice services, SMS and voice, to exclusively use an OTT player. There really hasn't been that much people abandoning that because the services are not ubiquitous availability. They have limited connectivity to other networks, and they're not always available, might be just available over Wi-Fi. So it really depends on the service itself. But you certainly have a high penetration of usage. So you may have minutes moving over, but you don't necessarily have a huge amount of monetary value moving over. In particular, customers saying, I'm not going to pay, I'm going to pay, whoever it may be, Skype or somebody else, $5 a month, where I used to pay, whoever it may be, Sprint or T-Mobile or Verizon or AT&T, $25 a month for their line. You haven't had that sort of cord cutter perspective on the mobile side. So you have choices. We may be talking in a year or two or 5 years from now where that's actually more of a reality. So let's talk about how far in the future these 2G and 3G networks will fall. Okay, and if we just do a simple play it forward, okay, that's where it's going. So you could see 2G and move all the way out to potentially go to 0 in say 2030, and you have in this sort of projection, and obviously nobody can predict the future. If I could predict the future, I'd be playing the stock market. But this is showing you slash 2040. Okay, that may not turn out to be true. It really depends. There's a lot of variables there. On the 2G side, in particular with Internet of Things, my expectation is that's probably going to stick around a whole lot longer than 3G will, and that's because there's sort of an embedded base of that, and a vast majority of the Internet of Things devices are probably hanging off the 2G network at this point because of kind of low cost and low power and that sort of perspective. And I would expect the higher power and more sort of latency sensitivity to move up into LTE. Okay, so it really depends on how long these things are happening. If we take a quick look at, so I did a webinar probably 3 weeks ago now with RCR Wireless, and just asked this question: how long would you expect your SS7 network to stick around? And this is the availability of options. And we had relatively small polling numbers, somewhere in the 50 to 60 range. So we're not talking a good broad section number, but these numbers on the poll results actually pretty much kind of conclude where my head is at with this. You have essentially from 2025 and below, which is 70% of the market, saying your SS7 network is going to at least last another 10 years from a production standpoint. And then you have some folks all the way out past 2030. So these are things you have to think about. You want to make sure you can continue to operationalize that. Some of us in the room may be heading to retirement in the next 10 years, and you're going to have to find somebody who's a little bit wet behind the ears to learn this incredible technology called SS7, to make sure they can get a call at 4 o'clock in the morning when it's not working correctly. So it's an important aspect of making sure your network and your services are available. All right, so just a question, kind of being a little provocative. What area is your SDP from? And so it could be something that's basically was designed and built for TDM somewhere back in the early 90s. This could be existing vendor. Most likely the design characteristics of it, and whenever you design a system, you obviously have constraints. You design for X, and sometimes the market moves. And so it could be designed for TDM, for example. It's very TDM-centric, and a lot of the customers that move from TDM links to over to SIGTRAN. It could have limited backplane capacity. It could potentially have something like ATM in the backplane, which those words aren't spoken very much in sort of the networking circles right now, because it's really been say the mid 2000s. ATM was not really a technology that folks were heading towards. So it could be an expensive upgrades, forklift upgrades, could be end of life, end of product sale, end of service. And depending on the vendor and when they design some of this equipment, there could be RoHS worries. And what I mean by that is there's a European requirement not to have lead-based components in the systems you sell to Europe, particularly the EU. And so with that, you may have a vendor that's going to say, all right, well, if you want to stay on this piece of equipment, that's all well and good, but I have to basically import a whole bunch of stuff ahead of sort of a cutoff date, which I think is July of next year. And there's costs associated with that. And because of that, I have to charge you 30% more in your maintenance contract, because I'm pre-staging, basically sparing equipment for you if you're not going to move up to the next rev that may then be RoHS compliant. In the middle, we have the IP-based system. So this is one of the systems that Sonus offers, and this is either TCA or micro TCA based. It's an easy migration.